When former US President Barack Obama unexpectedly praised Ibrahim Traoré on a global stage, the world turned its eyes to Burkina Faso. But what followed wasn't fame. It was a quiet revolution that proved Africa never needed saving, only the chance to lead itself. Before we dive into this powerful true story, tell us where you're watching from. And don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories that deserve to be heard. Now let's begin. The morning in Ouagadougou began with its usual quiet rhythm, soft golden light brushing over rooftops, birds weaving lazy circles in the air, and the hum of distant motorbikes just starting to echo across the capital. Inside the presidential palace, however, a different kind of energy was building. Ibrahim Traoré, president of Burkina Faso, sat in his modestly arranged office, absorbed in a thick stack of policy updates. The pages carried news of agricultural projects, community-led reforms, and grassroots education drives, all efforts he had spearheaded to steer his country toward dignity and independence without leaning on foreign crutches. His eyes were sharp but tired, not from lack of sleep, but from the weight of responsibility that never really left his shoulders. The silence broke when his assistant Marie rushed in, her face pale and breath unsteady. She held a tablet tightly in her hands and spoke with urgency that instantly cut through the stillness. "Sir, you need to see this," she said. Without hesitation, he took the tablet, expecting perhaps a security update or an urgent internal matter. What greeted him instead was a live international press conference streaming from the United States. The familiar figure of former US President Barack Obama stood on a stage, addressing a global audience. Obama's speech, elegant as always, touched on leadership, resilience, and the challenges of a fractured world. But then, almost casually, yet with purpose, he said something that made Traoré sit straighter in his chair. "Burkina Faso," Obama began, his voice calm and resonant, "is one of the clearest examples we have today of transformation driven from within. Under President Ibrahim Traoré's leadership, this small but courageous nation is showing the world that self-sufficiency and dignity are not utopian dreams. They are entirely possible." For a long, quiet second, Traoré simply stared at the screen. It wasn't just the sound of his name. It was the validation, unexpected and powerful, coming from a voice the world respected. Obama went on, "He has stepped away from traditional dependency models and is building a future based on mutual trust and the untapped strength of his own people. That is leadership." As applause filled the auditorium, the large screens behind Obama shifted to show vivid images of Burkina Faso. Women working in fields that had once been barren but now bloomed with harvest. Children learning in sunlit classrooms, and local engineers collaborating on solar energy solutions. Marie stood silently as the president absorbed it all, her expression slowly shifting from tension to pride. Traoré lowered the tablet gently onto his desk. "I didn't see that coming," he murmured. There was no smile on his face, only thought. His mind, already spinning, wasn't pulled toward ego or personal pride. It went straight to his people, to the villages he had visited, to the farmers who had trusted him, to the youth who dared to dream in a system that rarely gave them room to do so. "Marie," he said softly, "this isn't about me, but we do need to respond." He looked her in the eye, with humility, with gratitude, not just in words, but in actions. She nodded, already turning to arrange the team. Halfway across the globe, Barack Obama concluded his remarks with a final message, this time looking directly into the lens. "If you're watching this, Ibrahim," he said, "your courage is a reminder to us all that Africa doesn't need to be rescued. It needs to be respected." That single statement traveled fast, Within hours, the clip had been shared millions of times, spawning hashtags like Respect for Africa and Lead with Dignity. Talk shows, blogs, and news networks lit up with debates. Some praised the message as a long overdue recognition. Others questioned whether such ideals could truly last in a world dominated by geopolitics. But in the quiet of the palace office, Ibrahim Traoré sat still, already thinking beyond the noise. This wasn't a moment for celebration, it was a turning point. He stood up slowly, walking to the window that overlooked the city. Children were playing soccer in a dusty courtyard just outside the gates. Street vendors were setting up mourning stalls. Life went on, unaware of what had just shifted. And yet, for Traoré, the mission had just deepened. His next move wouldn't just answer the world, it would speak to the soul of his nation. The sun had not yet reached its peak when preparations inside the presidential palace began to take shape. The weight of Barack Obama's unexpected praise had settled in, not as a burden, but as a responsibility. Ibrahim Traoré stood before a simple mirror in his private quarters, adjusting the traditional woven sash across his shoulder, not for spectacle, but to silently honor the very people whose hands had crafted it. Outside, a press conference was being arranged in the palace courtyard. Local journalists gathered, their eyes wide with anticipation, while international media crews rolled in, setting up their lights and sound, eager to capture the reaction of the man who had suddenly become a symbol of modern African leadership. When Traoré stepped onto the small wooden stage, the energy of the crowd shifted, not with frenzy, but with a stillness that demanded attention. He didn't raise his hands or gesture grandly. He simply began. "Yesterday," he said in a calm, grounded voice, "a respected leader across the ocean mentioned our country. He spoke my name. But what mattered more than the mention was the meaning behind it." He paused, letting the silence hang, not to create drama, but to let every person feel the gravity of what was coming. Barack Obama spoke about dignity, about courage, about self-reliance, and while those words were addressed to me, I want to be very clear, they belong to all of you. The applause that followed was not thunderous, it was heartfelt. And then came the moment he had carefully crafted with his advisors overnight. "Today, we launch a national initiative," he declared, "called Sovereign Future. This is not a political move. This is a promise that every village, every town, every soul in this country will have the chance to solve their own challenges, using their own wisdom, without waiting for someone else to rescue them." The statement sparked a mix of admiration and skepticism, especially among some foreign correspondents. One French journalist raised her hand. "Mr. President, with all due respect, how can a developing nation implement this without foreign support? Isn't that too ambitious?" Traoré looked at her, not dismissively, but with calm resolve. "The greatest risk is not failure," he said gently. "The greatest risk is giving away our dignity in exchange for comfort. We will make mistakes, yes, but they will be ours, and so will the victories." Cameras flashed, microphones leaned forward. The world was listening. Behind the scenes, Marie was already coordinating meetings with ministers and regional leaders. The Ministry of Agriculture began scheduling field visits, and local engineers were being contacted to help plan infrastructure projects that aligned with the Sovereign Future framework. In the outskirts of the city, in a quiet neighborhood, a woman named Fatou was listening to the president's speech on a small battery-powered radio. She was a single mother, a carpenter by training, but had long abandoned her tools due to lack of resources. When she heard the president speak of communities solving their own problems, something inside her stirred. An old fire she thought had gone out. She looked at her hands, calloused but capable, and whispered, "Maybe it's time again." Within a week, She would reopen her small workshop, not just for herself, but for other women in the area who needed income, purpose, and power. Meanwhile, on social media, Obama's words and Traoré's response continued to ripple. Celebrities, activists, and scholars began debating what it meant for the global development model. Was Africa finally flipping the narrative? Was self-reliance not only possible, but contagious? In Washington, Obama was asked during a follow-up interview what had inspired him to mention Traoré so publicly. He smiled and said, "Sometimes leadership shows up quietly. Ibrahim didn't ask for attention. He earned it." Back in Burkina Faso, school teachers began adding new lesson plans about local history, local heroes, and the idea that solutions can come from home. In a dusty schoolyard, a boy named Mamadou watched as his teacher pinned a poster on the classroom wall that read, "Africa does not need saving, it needs space to grow." That phrase would become a slogan, painted on buildings, chanted at rallies, and printed on t-shirts. And Fatou, her workshop now alive with hammering, laughter, and wood shavings, hung the same phrase above her door. But Traoré was not watching from a distance. He visited, quietly. One morning, dressed in a plain shirt and a wide-brimmed hat, he walked into Fatou's workshop unannounced. She looked up in shock, covered in sawdust. He smiled. "I heard you reopened," he said. "I had to see it for myself." Fatou nodded, unsure what to say. "It's not much yet," she murmured. "It's more than enough," he replied. And with that, he sat beside her, rolled up his sleeves and picked up a wooden block. Around them, the world might have still been watching, still questioning, still doubting. But inside that little shop, something powerful was taking shape. Not through declarations or donors, but through hands, heart, and hope. As the weeks unfolded, the tremors of Burkina Faso's new direction traveled further than even Traoré had expected. The Sovereign Future program, though still young, had already begun transforming small corners of the nation into testaments of possibility. In rural schools where dusty chalkboards once bore faded lessons, students now read from new materials written in their own languages. At the heart of it all, Traoré remained grounded. He wasn't swept away by the global attention or headlines painting him as a revolutionary. Instead, he doubled down on quiet action. In a modest strategy room inside the palace, lined not with marble but with maps, handwritten notes and community data, he and Marie, along with a small circle of advisors, held nightly discussions about resource allocation, water access, road repairs, and ways to redirect international curiosity into long-term partnerships rather than dependency. One evening, after hours of deliberation over irrigation plans for the north, Marie asked softly, "Do you ever wish it had all stayed quiet?" Traoré thought for a moment before answering, "Silence is safe, but our people deserve more than safety. They deserve change." Outside that room, change was visible. Local journalists reported on village meetings where elders and youth debated, for the first time as equals, on how to use community grants. In one village, a group of teenage girls had proposed and led the creation of a women-run seed bank. In another, solar panels donated by local businesses powered the first night school in its district. Meanwhile, the international world watched closely, sometimes admiringly, sometimes with suspicion. Not every reaction was warm. A few foreign leaders questioned whether Traoré's resistance to aid was arrogance disguised as idealism. A prominent European analyst on television said, "It's poetic what he says, but romanticism won't feed nations." But others disagreed. In Nairobi, in Lagos, in Windhoek, young leaders began quoting Traoré's phrases in speeches. Hashtags like "Our Build from Home" and "African Blueprint" trended across digital platforms. And somewhere in the middle of all this global conversation, Barack Obama appeared once again, this time in a university dialogue session. When a student asked him about Traoré, Obama leaned forward, thoughtful. Leadership, he said, is not about being perfect. It's about standing firm in imperfect conditions. Traoré is not trying to be Africa's savior. He's proving Africa never needed one. Back in Burkina Faso, Traoré visited a new site, an innovation center built using recycled materials, designed entirely by local architecture students. Inside, he met with Fatou again, now working alongside Mamadou and others as part of a mentorship program. Fatou was guiding young women in vocational skills, while Mamadou had taken a special interest in climate-resilient farming. He reads about soil more than he sleeps, Fatou said with a laugh as Mamadou blushed. Traoré smiled deeply. This is what sovereignty looks like, he said, not in documents, but in people. That evening, Traoré addressed the nation. On public radio, his voice was soft, deliberate. This journey we've begun is not about headlines. It's about hunger and healing. It's about roofs that don't leak, roads that don't vanish in the rain, children who don't give up, unlearning because they think no one cares. We are not proving anything to the world. We are building something for ourselves. His words reached far, including to Obama, who, according to one advisor, listened to the broadcast live in his DC home. It is said that when it ended, he simply sat still, whispered, "This guy's the real thing," and made no further comment. The following week, during a regional summit in Accra, several West African leaders publicly expressed interest in adapting parts of the sovereign future model to their own contexts. It wasn't a movement yet, but the spark was undeniable. Traoré, however, did not let the growing attention distract him. He stayed rooted in villages, sitting under mango trees to hear concerns, eating with locals, sleeping in guest homes. Without entourage, when leaders forget the smell of earth, he once said to Marie, they start planting trees on paper instead of soil. And that's how the change continued. Not like fireworks, but like sunrise. Steady, soft, irresistible. The wind carried the scent of the harvest as Ibrahim Traoré stood atop a low hill overlooking the fields outside Koudougou, watching farmers work side by side in the warm afternoon sun. Below him, families planted, watered, and shared jokes between tasks. These weren't just farms, they were proof that people, when given a voice and the tools to act, could transform dust into life. Word of Burkina Faso's quiet transformation had begun spreading deeper into the continent and beyond. Delegates from nearby nations began sending observers to document how local leadership could replace bureaucratic aid. What they saw wasn't a revolution of scale, it was a revolution of soul. Every initiative was small, but intensely personal. A local engineer used broken bicycle parts to create a community water pump. A mother turned her courtyard into a daycare so other women could work. At the heart of it all was the philosophy that change didn't have to arrive in giant grants or foreign accents. It could rise from inside, from names that had never touched a headline. In a shaded community center built from mud bricks and woven straw, Marie sat with young volunteers, sketching out plans to map electricity access across rural provinces. "We're not just tracking numbers," she said to one eager girl. "We're tracking dignity." Traoré, meanwhile, was preparing for the biggest test yet, an address at the Pan-African Unity Conference in Addis Ababa. Leaders across the continent were watching him now, no longer with vague curiosity, but with real expectations. Would he speak to the room as a symbol or as a servant? When the day arrived, Traoré chose his words with precision, but his tone remained quiet, intimate, and deliberate. "We are not gathered here to impress each other," he began, "but to ask, what have we built that will outlive us?" He spoke not of numbers, but of Fatou, who was now exporting handmade furniture and training women from 6 villages. He mentioned Mamadou, who had just published his first research paper on soil salinity, despite being only 17. "If we want our people to trust us," Traoré said, "we must first trust them." The applause was long, not because of grand promises, but because of the way his words made the room feel, seen, challenged, and reminded. But not everyone in the hall was clapping. Several international financial consultants exchanged quiet glances, whispering about the implications of Traoré's model. One of them later commented off camera, "If more countries follow him, we lose control." And perhaps that was exactly the point. Back in Burkina Faso, Traoré's words triggered new waves of energy. Neighborhood councils began drafting their own mini-constitutions. Market women organized financial cooperatives. Even prisoners in a high-security facility were granted the right to propose work programs through a pilot rehabilitation policy. Meanwhile, Traoré's core team, small, tight-knit and driven, was expanding operations without fanfare. They created a national mentorship network pairing experienced farmers with unemployed youth. They pushed universities to adopt community-focused research. They distributed manuals, not filled with policy jargon, but practical guidance: how to build a solar stove, how to reclaim overfarmed land, how to turn stories into lessons. One evening, Marie brought a letter to Traoré's desk. It was handwritten, folded carefully, and signed only M. Inside were a few paragraphs about a forgotten village that had gone decades without electricity, and how, after watching one of Traoré's speeches, a group of teenagers there had connected wires using scrap metal and powered their school for the first time. "We don't want you to fix everything," the note said. "Just don't forget us." Traoré read it in silence, then folded it again and placed it inside a leather journal he kept locked away, not for security, but for memory. "That," he said softly, "is why we keep going." Days later, Fatou was invited to a televised forum to speak about her journey. Nervous but determined, she sat in front of bright lights and flashing cameras and said, "The only thing the president gave me was belief. The rest we found in ourselves." Her words traveled across borders. In Malawi, a similar woodworking program was launched. In Ghana, youth leaders named a literacy drive Project Mamadou. Slowly, this wasn't just about Burkina Faso anymore. It was about people reclaiming their right to build, to fail, to rebuild without apology. And as for Traoré, he continued to walk through markets, shake dusty hands, and sit quietly in back rooms listening to elders. He never hired a PR team, never bought airtime. He didn't need to. His message was in the air now, passed between people like a story too important to forget. The air was thick with anticipation as crowds gathered outside the newly built Futur Souverain Innovation Center in Bobo-Dioulasso. It wasn't a grand structure. Its walls were made of polished clay, its roof a fusion of solar tiles and woven palm wood, but it felt monumental, not because of its size, but because of what it stood for. Inside, students rehearsed their presentations, volunteers tested the sound system, and Marie moved from room to room with quiet urgency, making sure every detail was in place. Today was not just a celebration, it was a milestone, a reflection of a national promise that had grown from whispered hope into undeniable proof. When Ibrahim Traoré arrived, there was no motorcade, no cheering lines, no stage announcements. He stepped out of a modest four-door vehicle wearing a plain white shirt and traditional woven pants. People moved aside naturally, not because they were told, but because his presence spoke for itself. As he walked through the crowd, his eyes caught familiar faces, children from remote villages now in uniform, former factory workers now mentors, elderly women selling handmade crafts whose designs had gone viral overseas. And near the main entrance, standing quietly with a notebook in her hand, was Fatou. She looked older, stronger. Her carpentry program had trained over 200 women. By now, she smiled as he approached, her voice barely above a whisper. "My mother always said this day would come." Traoré's eyes softened. Then she saw the future before we did. Inside the center's main hall, the event began not with speeches, but with stories. Real people took the stage to share what they had built. Solar ovens made from recycled metal, libraries in old buses, gardens grown on abandoned land. When Mamadou stepped forward, the applause echoed long before he spoke. In a steady voice, he described his journey from rural student to published researcher. "We were never waiting for a miracle," he said. "We were waiting to be trusted." By the time Traoré was invited to the podium, the room was already full of tears, laughter, and quiet awe. He didn't carry papers. He didn't need them. "We are not here today to admire walls or wires," he began. "We are here to recognize the invisible work that brought us here. The work done in silence, in kitchens, in corners, in forgotten places where people never stopped believing." He spoke of the dignity that came not from aid, but from agency, of the courage it took to fail forward, of the responsibility leaders carry not to speak the loudest, but to listen the longest. Then, with the cameras rolling, he turned to the lens. "Mr. Obama," he said calmly, "your words months ago lifted our spirits. But today I want to say this. You weren't praising a man. You were witnessing a movement. This isn't my legacy. This is my people's voice rising." The hall burst into applause, not manufactured or timed, but raw and real. As he stepped down, he paused beside Fatou, placed a hand gently on her shoulder and said, "You are what this country has always been waiting for." The day continued. With poetry, food, and shared memories, children played outside in the same soil their parents had once called hopeless. Reporters captured moments but quickly realized the real story wasn't just a leader, it was a community healing itself. That evening, as dusk settled in and lanterns lit the streets, Marie sat with Traoré on the center's rooftop. They looked out at the people dancing below. "Do you think it's enough?" she asked softly. Traoré didn't answer right away. He watched a young boy carry a basket of books toward a group of elders, watched an old woman teach a girl how to weave string into strength. "It's not about being enough," he finally said. "It's about being true." Back in Washington, Obama watched clips of the event in silence. During a late-night interview on a news show, he was asked again about Traoré. "This guy," he said, smiling faintly, "he reminded the world that the strongest power isn't influence, it's example." The next morning, on a hand-painted wall in a village just beyond the Sahel, someone wrote in chalk, "We were never poor. We were only unheard." That single line would be shared across continents. It would become the title of documentaries, the theme of conferences, and the name of countless grassroots movements that had quietly been waiting for permission to rise. But in Burkina Faso, things remained simple. Traoré returned to his small home, watered the plants on his front porch, and began reading letters sent by schoolchildren. In one, a young girl wrote, "Dear President, I planted a mango tree. I will protect it the way you protect us." He smiled, folded the paper, and placed it next to his journal. No applause, no cameras, just a seed of a future planted by the people, for the people.